Good evening. Welcome to the Filson. My name is Kelly Heiberger, and I'm the Director of Curatorial Affairs here at the Filson. Thank you for joining us tonight for this program celebrating Women's History Month. Thank you again for joining us tonight for Astride, Horses, Women, and a Partnership that Shaped America. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to remind everyone to please silence your cell phones for the duration of our program. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the comments, and I'll pass around the microphone so that everyone in the audience can hear the questions. If you're joining us virtually tonight, you can use the chat feature to enter your questions, and I'll be able to access those and share them with the author if time permits. So it's my honor and privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, Eliza McGraw. Eliza McGraw is a Tony Ryan Book Award winning author of Here Comes Exterminator, The Longshot Horse, The Great War, and the Making of an American Hero, and a contributing writer for EQUUS magazine. Her articles have appeared in Blood Horse, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and on Smithsonian.com. Please join me in welcoming Eliza McGraw to the Filson.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here tonight. I spent a lot of time in Louisville when I was researching my book, Here Comes Exterminator, especially at Churchill Downs. And next time you're there, you see 1918, you'll see his name on the roster of winners. And I really grew to love it here, and I'm happy to be back. My book tonight is about more of a time in America than one specific character. And I'm going to start by reading a little bit from the introduction, but I don't want you to panic because I'm not going to read all the way through. Okay, so it's okay, but I am going to start with reading. And then one of the great things about this book is that it's full of images. And so I'm going to sort of take you on a little bit of a tour of the book using some of the pictures that I found. So just hang in there. I'm just going to set the stage, and then we will move to more pictures. Okay. In the years from 1890 to 1925, American women rode horses. Many pioneered, taking their places among the first women to manage Kentucky stud farms, play polo, and ride bucking broncos. They played basketball on horseback, floated mounted beneath air balloons, held jousting competitions, and jumped horses through flaming hoops for whistling, cheering audiences. Some abandoned side saddles and rode astride. Others flaunted tradition by catch riding for money or tearing across open country on fox hunters. The desire to attract attention often induces women to ride, intoned an 1892 riding manual. And horses did draw attention, but not through coquetry. Women of that era dared in general, risking their bodies and staking their place among athletes. Many of these endeavors bore an equestrian stamp, as women rode bicycles downhill at speed, straddled motorcycles, and piloted airplanes in breeches and boots. An elemental connection to horses tapped an age-old power that had belonged to knights and soldiers. So if you think back to sort of some of the images of the pioneering women of that time, you know, the aviatrixes in their planes, things like that, they're sort of wearing riding clothes. It was kind of a coded way to show that you were ready to take on the world, and just something that I really noticed when I was writing Here Comes Exterminator, that the women sort of what we call the new woman era, this turn of the century time, very much relied on sort of the messaging, as we would call it now, of horseback riding to show power and independence. Do women just really love horses, or do horses love women? Writes contemporary endurance rider Lara Pryor Palmer. Riding has offered a counter-existence to women since before the times of Lady Godiva or the Amazons of Scythia, one in which we can be demanding and assertive. In the counter-existence of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, tableau vivants no longer satisfied. Instead, women rallied the petticoat cavalry and rode bucking broncos, remaking femininity to include equestrianism. All of this took place during a very horse-focused time in America. There were 130,000 horses in Manhattan alone in 1900, or 26.4 humans per horse. They mostly carried men, including police officers, park riders, and cowboys. Theodore Roosevelt brought the cult of horses with him to the White House, where he had the stables retrofitted to his specifications. But as the 20th century began, many men ceded horses to cars. Celebrities like Alice Roosevelt Longworth and Helen Keller, along with cowgirls, circus riders, hunt seat instructors, and debutantes, claimed horsepower for themselves. Reporters filed riding-crazed stories about Manhattan socialites shopping on horseback, women who rode hobby horses for exercise, women horsebreakers, cattle rustlers, and jockeys. From the vantage point of the 21st century, the partnership of women and horses seems preordained. In fact, the image of the horse-besotted girl and her pony has even grown cliche. But at the turn of the century, that story hadn't been widely told. Enid Bagnold, for example, didn't publish National Velvet until 1935, and Elizabeth Taylor didn't play velvet on screen until 1944. Unencumbered by the yet-to-come horse girl myth, American horsewomen took part in the horse's golden age, the last half of the 19th century, and the arrival of the new woman after the turn of the 20th. Several of these women stand out. Wolf-slaying Lucille Mulhall became famous as the first cowgirl. Beautiful doomed Belle Beach, an author and businesswoman, taught New York to ride. Studious expert Elizabeth Dangerfield, who drove around the Kentucky bluegrass with a car full of dogs and a pistol, managed Man o' War, the greatest racehorse of all time. Daredevil Mae Worth flipped somersaults on her circus horse Snowball, and humane activists across America advocated for urban workhorses and installed water fountains for them. The horsewomen of the New Women era found endless ways to work and play with horses, galloping over high plains, traversing thousands of miles, tending foals, competing for rosettes, marshaling parades. They were with horses in that most specialized form of accompaniment that only riders know, characterized by the longing that defines partnership with these animals, to go faster, higher, to move with increasingly joined motion. With horses, there's always more. The New Women knew this well. I think often of stout-hearted, category-defiant Madame Marentet, a rider who moved the puissance wall ever upward, rode everlasting laps during endurance races, and scolded for hours and hours until her high school horses could predict her commands and execute the most delicate sequences. You can't confine yourself to one thing. You must do everything if you are going to be successful, she said in 1903. As a horsewoman, I think this makes sense. For the purposes of this book, I sorted figures into categories to create some order. But no matter what discipline we prefer, our experiences transcend boundaries. I thought of the humane workers who saw relief and mercy in letting sick horses go when I had to have a beloved 30-year-old mare put down. In Maryland, where my mare Audie is boarded, horsewomen campaigned for conservation, much in the way that suffrage riders did, using parades, visibility, and work alongside other interest groups. We thrilled to others' horses at a show or race, just reveling in the life of the horse, their presence among us, the way so many horsewomen did at Madison Square Garden or at rodeos. And we believe in the specialness of our own horses, as distance rider Nan Aspinwall placed her faith in her thoroughbred mare, Lady Ellen. Like cowgirls, we fall off and we get back on. Okay, so let's meet some of these important women. Still at the glasses on, glasses off phase, so to see these larger images, have to bear with me. Okay, this is an image I selected, and I was telling Scott earlier, because I'm in Washington, D.C., I have great access at the Library of Congress. They have an astonishing prints and photographs division. It is really digitized, so if you're history people and you're here, I really do recommend browsing it from home. Some of the images you have to go to see fully, but just side note, Library of Congress, prints and photographs, lots of fun. This is a very famous athlete named Eleanor Sears, who was riding Astride pretty early on, and you can see just a group of reporters kind of marveling at her celebrity, and she's up on horseback here. And my book, I start with talking about the suffrage riders, and they sort of called themselves, and reporters loved the name, the petticoat cavalry, because they were riding for the vote. They felt very strongly about this. And there was a lot of sort of mythology surrounding the way they dressed. So most of them rode astride at this point, but you can see there's sort of a combination of Lady Godiva, of being a knight. There's sort of all of these different impulses in the suffrage movement, and this is the official program from that day in 1913. Just a note about, we're going to see some women riding astride and some women side saddle. I, loved the name of the book and really worked. There are plenty of women still riding side saddle in this time period. It was definitely a time that more women started riding astride, but it was almost more that we got to a point where that choice could be made rather than everybody switching. And you'll see too, Western riders way more rode astride than on the East Coast in the early parts of this time period. So here's a picture of Inez Milholland, who was a powerful suffragist. That's her horse, Grey Dawn. The Roosevelts had a horse named Grey Dawn, and I went on a very long and very unfruitful quest to find out if it was the same horse. I had a great time on the quest, but I still don't know, and I kind of doubt it because I think that probably would have been mentioned. But you can see she was sort of the head of the parade, and she was in this sort of combination Greek goddess, Lady Godiva outfit on this white horse to really grab attention and have people watching the parade look at her and sort of understand what she was riding for. This is the same parade. This is a Western rider. She's got sort of the divided skirt on. She's there from Arizona and also on horseback. And you could just start to see this horse does not look, I would say, delighted probably either with maybe the camera in front of him, but you start to see how natural these women are on horseback. I do not personally want to, go riding down the middle of Pennsylvania Avenue with a big crowd like that, but these women really expected a lot of their horses, and for the most part, they really were able to get that. This is Inez Milholland again, so she's not in costume here, but I thought this was kind of a nice. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay. This is Inez Milholland again, and she is the same one who was in costume in the earlier picture, but this is her in a New York parade, and I just like to show this because she's in more probably what she might have worn to go riding on a regular day. And you see she's riding astride. She's in kind of culottes, like kind of a divided skirt. And she's also looking pretty comfortable up there. I noticed there's someone leading her horse in the first photo that I showed you, but she was a good rider. And I think this kind of shows a little bit more her comfort even in this time. And also shows just the crowds that were thronging for these parades. I don't have a photo that shows you kind of how many women were in them, but there's a lot of horses. Like when you look at the sort of larger crowd pictures, there's sort of more horses than I had thought, But like I said, they sort of called themselves the petticoat cavalry, and it was an important part of parades in general then, and it was an important part of these suffrage parades. So many of the women in the suffrage parades you saw were riding in city streets. They're perfectly comfortable. Especially on the East Coast, again, we had a lot of women who were urban horsewomen that rode in Central Park in New York and Rock Creek Park in Washington and the other sort of big parks. And if you've walked Central Park, you sort of have probably been on the bridle paths that are still there. That like sort of wonderful meandering quality is partially a legacy of when so many people rode. And another thing about Central Park that's kind of important for women and horses in this time was that there were a lot of livery stables back then. So now I'm sure we can't really imagine how this would be, but you used to just be able to rent a horse and go for a ride. I mean, maybe some of you all remember, I remember even in the 80s when I was growing up, it was easier to rent horses and go trail riding. And back then, there were big livery stables. One was called Derlin's and one was called Dickel's, and the horses had different patterned headstalls. So you would know if you were out in the park where the horses came from. And there was an urban legend that the horses rode the same path so much that one morning two had gone missing, and when they saw them in the morning, they were just trotting the loop side by side with no one riding them. I always think that must have been kind of fun if you were on a visit to New York just to rent a horse to go riding in the park. And here's an image of a woman side saddle with a horse with a docked tail, which came out of favor. Teddy Roosevelt did not like docked tails, and so he kind of helped lead a crusade against them, but it was still quite stylish when this was taken. I also like this picture because you can sort of see the overskirt often side saddle pictures are from the other side. You don't always see the side that her leg's not on. You know what I mean? You usually see the sort of fuller side, but this kind of shows you what it would have looked like from this side. These are just snapshots of women riding in New York. I pulled all of these from the Library of Congress. I like these pictures because I think these are some of the most timeless that I have. I feel like these women all look like, without the clothes, they could be, pictures you're getting on your phone of people and their horses today. Just the way they're trying to get them, she looks like she's trying to get him to look up a little bit, and the girls are posing with their horses, and here she's messing with this one while the other person's having her picture taken. So these weren't famous riders particularly or anything, but I just thought they kind of captured that feeling of familiarity and life kind of alongside horses in the city in this time. I wonder sometimes if that's one of the headstyles, because they talked about the patterning, but I couldn't quite get to the bottom of whether she just had a pretty headstall or if that was one of the exact patterns. So these urban horsewomen, who are often the same sort of suffrage riders, had pretty interesting lives. They were not, many of them had plenty of leisure time, so they had time to take riding lessons. They had the resources to have their own horses. Some people even had their horses brought back and forth to like vacation houses over the summer. And this is one of them whom I met, Lida Flightman Bloodgood. And you can just see she's having a good time at some sort of equestrian event in her awesome outfit. I write about her a fair amount because she wrote a lot about herself in that time. And she has great stories about the Madison Square Garden horse shows and how hard they would go. How much fun it was to be riding in Madison Square Garden in those days, which was a very horse-centered thing. There's a famous story about a bull getting loose and Will Rogers roping it, before he created havoc on the sidewalk. So you just imagine it was like the sort of central location for a lot of equestrian activities back then. And then these two pictures are from Washington. That's Mr. and Mrs. Roosevelt out for their ride. He rode pretty much every day, and they used to say that if you couldn't keep up with him, you did not get to talk. So if that was your allotted time to have a conversation with him, you would hope you were a good rider, because they would put you on a horse and he would take off and that was your time. So people had to sort of keep up with him. But he and his wife rode a lot too. And this is apparently was a kind of common sight. That's Mrs. Roosevelt's mare waiting for her. So people would know that they hadn't gone for their ride yet if she was tied up and waiting. And so you see she's got her side saddle on. But I think that's kind of a neat thing, the idea that if you were walking around downtown, you could kind of tell if they'd been out for their ride yet. This is another picture of a horse show. I don't drive myself, I'm a rider, but I always feel like the drivers get short shrift. So I wanted everybody to have some time to see that they also were horsewomen and also competed a lot. And so this is a horse show picture of someone in driving attire in Long Island. And the horse has blinkers on, and it's sort of a competition where it was almost like, you can see it's not really like a racing, it's not like a sulky the way we think of them now. It was more something that you would actually be driving. Just a full picture. And then these are more horse show pictures, and we have a side saddle rider and an astride rider. And it just kind of, again, if you spend any time at horse shows, you sort of see the universality. I kind of think of how long it takes sometimes between classes when you go watch a friend in a horse show, and you just think like time has stretched to just some sort of other dimension. And, this lady looks like she's kind of got that face on, things are just kind of wearing on, but her horse looks pretty patient. And then I just like this one because it's a little bit of a hell for leather jump up here. And everybody looks like they're having a good time. But these are more women that were competing. And this lady, Belle Beach, was one of the most famous horse show riders of the time. And she was one of the original, we call them now catch riders. Like, she would ride your horse in the horse show. So maybe a horse that you bred, but that you weren't going to be able to ride. She was an amazing rider. And she was also interesting because she and her mother before her were both riding instructors. So they sort of lived an interesting borderland of class in New York City because they were guests at the homes of many very wealthy clients. They would be at parties and events, but they were also working for these families. So she was really talented, and she wrote one of the preeminent riding manuals of the day, which is called Riding and Driving for Women. And she was a really big side saddle advocate. She thought it was okay for little girls to ride astride. She didn't do it herself, and she did not think it was an attractive way for women to ride. It never held her back. She could, I mean, she fox hunted, and they used to say that she rode as if she used silk threads for reins, that her hands were so light that, a horse could tell her touch that gently. And this is an image I got. I was telling Scott, I wanted to point out some of the images that I got from historical societies, because like I said, the Library of Congress has this huge repository, but I got some really, really terrific images from historical societies, just kind of showing how important they are when you're researching a broad spectrum, because often I feel like people think, oh, well, you need to be doing a really deep dive. But honestly, if you look widely, especially with how many collections are digitized, you really find great stuff in historical society. So thank you to the Historical Society, since we're in one, and that's where this came from. So you see she's on one of the Whitney's horses here in the middle, and these are just sort of almost like not like a calling card, but like an advertising thing for her. So this, I'm going to read a little bit more because this is one of our most famous Kentuckians that's in the book. And you all may know about Elizabeth Dangerfield already because she is so famous for managing Man o' War's stud career. It was not common. There were Josephine Clay, and there was a Maryland stud farm manager who was a woman, but it was not super common, especially because she was so famous. She was so important with one of the most important horses of this time. So I'm just going to talk about this image a little bit. The image of Dangerfield, and this is Colin. So if you know anything about horse racing, it's a very famous horse. On the cover of the September 20th, 1913 Thoroughbred record, which seems to be a pastiche of two photographs. This looks slightly cut out. Like you can see it sort of, she's a little bit, obviously not photoshopped, but whatever the predecessor to that was, commemorates the moment. Dangerfield stands in the foreground, her long skirt and fitted jacket reminiscent of a side saddle habit. She wears a dark brimmed hat and looks toward Colin, who in turn stands grandly, a ringed snaffle in his mouth and his tail held slightly aloft. She gave a lot of interviews. She had a lot of opinions about horse racing, which I think was kind of cool. And she was very outspoken. And one of her things that she felt very strongly about is she didn't think we should race 2-year-olds, which obviously we still do today. It was very common, but she felt very strongly about it. She trained young horses on turf instead of on hard dirt, and said the popular practice of handicapping, where racers carry lead bars in their saddle pads. Obviously, I don't have to tell you all that, but I do have to put in some of this racing stuff for anyone that might not know. Forced horses to bear too much weight. She referred to racing 2-year-olds as the slaughter of the innocents, and wrote that if the racing interests were interested in breeding instead of in betting, we should have a standard of thoroughbreds such as we can only dream about now. She also wrote book reviews and instructional articles. One piece advocated for roomy stalls. One does not buy diamonds and keep them in a coal scuttle, she wrote. Why give approximately as much for a horse and keep him in a woodshed? She gave advice both in writing and through interviews. Don't breed horses with ring bone. Don't depend on yearling sales for your horses. Better to run your own farm. Don't try to make up for poor feeding with quickly acquired soft flesh for the sales rank. Her horses were good-tempered, she said, because she allowed no harsh treatment. Noise around a horse was dangerous, and a man who carried a club into a stable would probably get killed one day, and frankly, he should. The big thought about taking care of horses is to love them, to care about them, she said. Her assistant, John Buckner, shared Dangerfield's passion for detail and obsessive memory. He once fired a groom for being too loud. Some men are alike as peas, she told a reporter, but I never knew two well-bred horses to be alike. They are individual, sincere, and courageous. A horse never lies to you. Okay. And then, so it was in 1920 that the great chestnut man of war broke records, grabbed headlines, and reigned as the undisputed king of thoroughbred racing. He was the most famous horse in the world, the horse of the century. Voluble and flush with success, his owner, Sam Riddle, could have hired anyone to take care of man of war's transition from racehorse to stud. He chose Dangerfield. Film, word, and cameras and 2,000 people pressed against the rail the day man of war made his last public appearance, galloping up and back at the Lexington racetrack, soggy with just melted snow. The master of ceremonies announced to cheers that the horse would be in the care of the premier horsewoman of America. He's a vigorous, healthy horse, Dangerfield said. Seems to have a fine disposition. We shall be friends. When a reporter pointed out what a coincidence it was the man of war, who never raced here, would wind up in Kentucky, she said, a coincidence perhaps that he should return to Kentucky, but not a coincidence that he should be born here. Kentucky is the only place on earth where the perfect horse could have been born. And she also prided herself, she did not travel very much. She didn't even go to the track very much. She stayed at the barn and took care of these horses and really set a precedent for care in breeding and horsekeeping that was very high among stud managers in general of those times. And this is a picture from Keeneland, from their library there, which has a great horse archive. These are just some women at Saratoga, sort of part of the thoroughbred industry at the time. They were owners, and there are a lot of stories of women in the sales rings, like excited about the horses that their husbands were buying. Exterminator's first trainer's wife reportedly named him, August Belmont's wife named him. They're just, it might not have been all their decisions, but women really run through these early years of thoroughbred racing. And here they are just enjoying a day at Saratoga. So again, staying with these sort of same women who are mostly urban, mostly had leisure time, this is the same people who often ran the humane societies. I'm such a wanderer. I'm trying really hard to stay near, I promise, Scott, but it's very hard to hang on. That ran humane societies. And if you think about it now, like even today, like horse rescues, thoroughbred aftercare, they're often run or managed and staffed by women. And that was something that was true back then also. So this elaborate fountain is actually for horses to be able to drink. One of the main sort of issues that drove the humane movement was that there wasn't enough fresh water for urban horses during the summer. And one thing about the humane movement back then is these ladies may have had their own horses were home in roomy stalls with all the grain they could want, but the horses they focused on were work horses. They were pulling streetcars, they were pulling wagons, they were pulling coal or, fire engines. And so they were very much focused on horses that were in the city in those days. And if you see the original seal for the ASPCA is an avenging angel going to stop a driver from hitting his horse who's fallen down. And so we sort of have these work horses to thank for the Humane Society movement in general. And so they did this in a number of ways. One was raising money for these fountains, which were sort of to blend in with urban landscapes. And then up in the top right, that is a workhorse parade. And so people would give prizes for the best tended and best looking workhorses. So people would bring their workhorses and you see the reviewing stand way over to the right, and they would walk them by judges and get prizes for, the handsomest coal horse, or, they'd get a special tag or special awards. And the idea was to encourage drivers and owners to take good care of these horses. The bottom picture is one of my favorites because it is a Christmas party for horses, which do horses need a Christmas party? I don't know, but the idea was that they would have apples and a little break and just some time in the day where their drivers would have a place to stop and recognize the season. So this was all done sort of by these Humane Association workers. Here's another one. This was something that I got to write an article about a couple years ago, which was the horse hat phase. Horse hats, we don't really see them too much anymore, but there was a time that people believed that horses should wear hats for shade. And you can see here's a humane worker putting on one of the hats with the little ears that come through. They would put them in cold water. They probably did feel kind of good, but they also, I think it turned out sometimes made the horses really hot. Like they didn't actually want to have like a giant hat on them. But for other people who have seen the Black Stallion a million times, you may remember that his friend Napoleon, who pulls a fruit wagon, has a hat with his little ears through it. So this is just one of the pictures of showing one worker giving this horse some grain and the other affixing a hat. Like that horse is definitely feeling like he did not get the good part of this visit. Hat versus snacks is not really debatable. So moving off of the sort of more urban ideas of horses in the city, these are sort of the cowgirls. And I got really interested in the cowgirls of this era because there are sort of the cowgirls that you see over to the right who are working on ranches out west. And there's a picture that I like of somebody riding side saddle in a Western saddle. And then up top, just a young girl, an actual cowgirl, like herding cattle on horseback. And then we have the rodeo riders, which is some of the greatest images of this time period that you're going to find. These are just amazing pictures of cowgirls at this rodeo. But this is really the time in which it kind of went from cowgirls as a job to as performers, taking the sort of tasks that they did on the ranch, just as they do with rodeo now, with roping and heeling and other things like that, and bringing them to show to Eastern audiences and for their own performances. So we have some performers over here on the left, and then some actual cowgirls. This is Lucille Mulhall, who I mentioned in the introduction. She was sort of called the first cowgirl, and she performed all kinds of tricks with her horses. She traveled all over, and she was the one who was in the arena when Will Rogers had to rope the runaway bull. She was a terrific rider. She was from Oklahoma, and she could pretty much, she was sort of famous for being able to ride anything from she was really young. And one story about her that was that I guess Teddy Roosevelt had first seen her at a Rough Riders reunion and had sort of just been smitten with how great a rider she was. I think there's some evidence to suggest that his own kids never kind of rode wildly the way that he did. And he just thought she was amazing. And she promised him that she would shoot a wolf for him. She was just the like epitome of this sort of ranch riding cowgirl. And she did. And she sent the wolf pelts to him for one of his houses in New York. So a lot of articles about her talked about that wolf, which I think is kind of a cool detail. And this is just a cowgirl riding very happily in a town. It's from Kansas. I just thought that was kind of a nice shot of somebody that wasn't in the middle of a performance, but just happy and looking very at home in the saddle and with the classic divided skirt. This is Kitty Knutt, who is one of the most famous women bronco riders, and there were actually more women bronco riders back then than there are now. I'm not really sure why that is, but there was a whole little sort of gallery of them. And I think this is a great picture. There's a book entirely about her that uses this photograph, but she was a pretty cool lady, and she was all over. Like this was not, these women performed often during sort of the heyday of this. So you would see them at different rodeos all over the West, and then some of them in Madison Square Garden. And those articles are great. Like there are terrific articles about Lucille Mulhall taking her whole retinue riding in Central Park, full cowgirl outfits, and people in New York just could not get enough of it. They loved it. Then the next chapter that I kind of go from the performances of the cowgirls to the circus riders. And here's where we sort of start to get into this like gray area where we've gone from women with plenty of leisure and resources and time to ride and keep their own horses and have whatever horses they want, to some of the cowgirls who are working pretty hard as actual ranch workers during the day and then riding rodeos. And the same thing with circus riders. They worked really hard. They did not have easy lives at all, and they sort of were in a time that people didn't always respect actresses. They were sort of more in that category. They didn't always get the kind of, esteem that other women may have gotten. but they got very, very famous and they did extraordinary tricks. There was all kinds of, ideas of them Roman riding, which is afoot on two galloping horses, or jumping through flaming hoops, or just like now when you go to circuses and you see these astonishing things. That was very much a part of going to the circus. I mean, horses are, always my favorite part of the circus for obvious reasons, but they, you think about how important horses are to a circus. And it was a way for these extraordinary, really, gymnasts and athletes to kind of work with horses to be part of the circus. So this is one person with her horses outside, and they called these sort of sturdy workhorse-looking guys, they called them rosinbacks, because they would use rosin on their feet to stick a little bit better when they were doing the tricks. And so they used these big, hefty draft horses and kept them nice and big so that there was a little more room for the circus riders to do their tricks. This is just another cool picture of, she's sort of hidden in the architectural details, but you can see she's on one horse and the horses are cantering around. Just always looks, it's so the sort of definition of without a net. I mean, there was like no safety regulation whatsoever. These women were very much putting themselves at risk to do this. I had a little bit of a jump here, but I also was learning during this time, there was a huge interest in endurance riding, like what we would think of as endurance riding, like people going on these incredibly long rides. Again, some of that goes back to Roosevelt, who used to like dare his army officers to ride as long as he did. He sort of felt like they weren't fit enough and he could stay in the saddle all day. And Martha Blow Wadsworth bettered his record by a lot. She was like, I can stay in the saddle a lot longer than that. And this is another great find from Historical Society. This comes from the State University of New York at Geneseo, which is near where she lived. And she was a sort of society woman in Washington, D.C. This was where her country house was, but she went on these extraordinary cross-country rides. And sort of, if you've had any experience with endurance riding today, a lot of it has to do with vet checks. They'll stop and make sure the horse's heart isn't going too fast, that the horse is not under too much duress. And she very much took care of her horses in that respect. So she would keep riding, but she'd switch out her horses a lot. This is Madame Marintet, who I mentioned. Okay, another testament to the Historical Society. This came from, and completely nonplussed. They were like, oh, sure, the picture with the ostrich, like we can get that to you, no problem. From St. Joseph in Michigan. And she was sort of one of my examples of just the most boundary crossing. Like she was in a circus, she rode racehorses, she apparently strapped an ostrich to, sulky. She was just an incredible performer, incredible athlete, and she worked with horses. I think the ostrich was a bit of a novelty. There's not like a lot about the ostrich, but it is an ostrich. And again, people who knew her well at the Historical Society were very used to this ostrich image, but I was pretty dazzled when I saw it. But she was an amazing, she was one of these people I couldn't figure out what chapter to put her in, because as soon as I read something about her I'm like, okay, great, she's in the circus, I'm putting her in the circus. And then there would be some long thing about how she'd won a long riding competition with her sister. And I was like, all right, you're going with the long riders. So finally, if you read the book, she just shows up all the time because she was just this astonishing figure. And this is I also thought this was kind of cool. Just the image is, this, her breaking a record, which I can't imagine, like, who was the other ostrich? I mean, I think it was just her and the ostrich, but I think her point was that she could get going so fast, even if she only had one horse. So she was just a very interesting lady. And all of these riders were people who just were pushing limits. So these coming up are more long riders. This is from Illinois and the Illinois Historical Society. And this was Alberta Clare, and she and her horse and her dog did a cross-country ride. You'll see there's another rider who did a similar thing, but this is kind of a great shot, I think, of, what more do you need? I mean, she's got the two most important figures for her ride, and she, stayed on the whole time and rode. I think she went She may have gone, I'm not sure, she may have gone east to west, and then the next rider, let me show you, this is Nan Aspinwall. She was a trick rider too, and she went west to east. And she was on a thoroughbred mare named Lady Ellen, and people were really following her story. And to the point that the horse became so famous that later when Nan Aspinwall had really had it with, I mean, after riding across the country, she was sort of like, I'm out horse-wise. And so the horse stayed in New Jersey and like was still famous on her own, even without her rider. But she was another performer who sort of did this for attention and to better a record. So then we reached the, like, again, pushing these limits, pushing boundaries. There was a craze during this time of diving horses. And there were diving horses in this country actually up until the middle of the 20th century, but it became very isolated. These were horses that went on the road and they would go to state fairs and small, county fairs and jump off these high dives into water. And you can see this horse does not have a rider. And this, I just set this up to show you the next picture. And many of you guys may have seen a movie called Wild Hearts Can't Be Broken, about a girl that does this, and they often went blind because the women went blind because the impact of hitting the water at the time, like they could get detached retinas, which could not be fixed back then. So it was this incredibly like life risking sport, or I don't even know if it was a sport, but as you can sort of see these two trains on the tracks, the Humane Society people were not thrilled about the diving horse situation, and sentiment turned a little bit. It went from people lining up to see it to being like, do they like this? Like, are there horses diving like this? And so there were still like horses on the Atlantic City Pier closer to mid-century, but for the most part, it kind of died out. But it did leave us with some astonishing images, and you can see how packed this fair is. I mean, how deeply the crowd goes to line up to watch, and you can imagine it was a short, kind of thing. But one of the articles I read with someone opposing it was saying, I mean, the horse can't, once they're up there, what are they going to do? So they were saying it didn't feel like entertainment. And that was sort of, you could just see that sentiment was starting to change and people weren't turning out for it as much. But again, these were women with not maybe a million choices in society. And that is a pretty crazy image. Okay. This is just another one of my urban horse ladies, because we're kind of coming back to the end here. And again, I just think there's a real comfort and an ease with the way that she's sitting. And it just is something that I feel like is kind of important when we're thinking about these women, is again, the sort of versatility and what they were using the horses for. And this one I particularly like, because you see the cars behind her. So it's really kind of showing this time in society when things were changing, and there was a lot of press about men being interested in cars and the horses sort of being left to the women. But in the book, I sort of talk about the idea of what they were using horses for and how it was sort of this astonishing partnership. I do tend to get ahead of myself with book titles. So I was talked down from the partnership that made America to a partnership that shaped America, which I think is probably fair. But once you get after the colon, you get kind of rolling. But I do think it was, despite that, I do think it was a really important partnership that kind of, I wouldn't say it's been unnoticed, but I felt like it deserved a little more attention than it had gotten. And so that is how I wound up writing an entire book on this. But I'm happy to answer any questions that people have, or just tell you more about any of these ladies also.
I'll just start us off with a quick question, just a curiosity.
Yeah.
When the horses would be diving, would they set them up to dive into natural bodies of water, or would they construct pools?
They did. I've seen stuff about both, about like the ones on Atlantic City, I think were going into the water, but I think there were really deep pools at some of them. So I think there was a lot of building going on, but I do not know a ton about that, but it is kind of strange.
Does anybody have any questions?
Hi, are there still endurance or long distance racing. I know in the Middle East, they have, I don't even know what the name of it, but I know they train horses to run cross country, but do we still do that in the United States?
We do, they're called endurance rides. So it's kind of like people that run those like 100-mile races and stuff. We have people that ride like that too. But interesting that you mentioned the Middle East, because often the horses that do that are Arabians. Because they're just so great at going for so long, and they're lighter bodied. But it's a pretty diligent group out there that's doing that. And some people do it, ride and tie, where they switch off riding or they switch off horses. But so now, like that's what I was saying, is that Wadsworth was really ahead of her time, because now one of the main things with that is the horse's health. Like, okay, they've been going this long. You can't get another rider on and keep going until they've made sure that the horse is okay. So it's not as much of a spectator thing, but we do have it.
So when did women start riding in the Kentucky Derby?
Well, I think Diane Crump may have been the first in the 70s. I don't, that was not, there were women jockeys that I cover some in the thoroughbred racing chapter. And one of the things I loved about reading about them was they were always called the only woman jockey or the first woman jockey. And then we kind of got to a point, later, where there were what people called powder puff derbies, where it would be all women riders. And a lot of times it was really accomplished hunter jumper riders would just hop on and, ride races in jockey silks for sort of novelty races and stuff. But yeah, it wasn't until pretty late in the 20th century that there were a lot of women riding in grade 1 stakes races.
Were there any women who were riding on the Pony Express during its existence?
I do not know about any, but if you watch the TV show about it, there was a girl in that. So maybe that was based on reality, but I do not know that much about it. I do love reading about the Pony Express. It was a really short-lived thing. I mean, it's kind of crazy because it's just so large in our imagination. You just think like, oh, the Pony Express years, but it did not last a very long time. I know there were women who, I mean, more recently, I think there was a race or a ride, at least along the Pony Express route. And I think plenty of women riders have done that, but I do not know of any women in that actual day. I did not really very much. The suffrage riders, I know that, our suffrage movement took a lot from the movement in England, which is obviously also a very horse-focused country. And so I read some of that. There was a terrible incident there where a suffrage rider or suffrage, activist was run over by a racehorse. Like, she went to a big horse race to sort of draw attention to the cause, and horse ran over her. So there was a sort of violent collision there, but I did not really study too much with other countries.
I enjoyed the book lecture.
Thank you.
There was one photo in particular that caught my attention, the girl with the dog in Wyoming. Any background information on that one? Are there any more photos like that?
I don't have any other photos like that of her, but I bet there are some, just because she was enough of a celebrity to be doing that ride. But I love that photo too. And it was an impressive feat, to set out like that with her horse and her dog. And I like that she had the dog in the picture. I thought that was. Question. Anyone else?
Any final questions for the evening? No. All right, well,
Okay. I have one more slide, which is my daughter and my horse. So anyway, there they are. That was just sort of this winter's, moment of horses and women together. But thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
thank you so much for coming.